Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Let me start this story by telling you a bit about myself. My name is Jake, I'm 26, and I work in accounting. I came from a pretty poor family, so growing up, I didn't have a lot of things that most people my age had. But when I was 18 and I was getting ready for university, my parents and I decided that at this point, I needed a laptop. But since they were really expensive, we decided to look for a second-hand one. So every day after my summer job, I would browse Craigslist for something around my price range that was still usable. After a few days of browsing, I found a 2007 Dell that wasn't completely outdated. I contacted the vendor to see if it was still available, and to my luck, it was. We worked out a date for me to check it in person and then potentially buy it. Then when the day came, I got dropped off by my dad at the seller's residence while my old man waited in his pickup. He was trying to help me get out of my shell since I was a shy kid growing up, so he often made me do things on my own so I could get some more self-confidence. I knocked on the door and waited, and after a moment of silence, I could hear a kid yelling from the other side of the door, only for it to be opened by a man in his mid-30s. He smiled and asked how he could help me, and I introduced myself and told him that I was here to check out the laptop that he was selling. He said, "Oh, of course. I just need to grab it. Do you want to come in or do you want to wait on the porch?" I told him that I'd be fine waiting on the porch. He nodded and told me that he would be right back before closing the door. After about a minute, the man opened the door, laptop in hand, and sat down in one of the chairs as he booted up the computer. It turned on perfectly, and then he handed it to me. I opened Internet Explorer to check if everything worked, and seeing the window open and connect, I was very satisfied. This would do the job. I handed him the money before I got up with my new laptop. And as I was walking down the driveway, the man called out to me. I turned around confused, thinking, did I do something wrong? I looked back at him to see him holding a cable. "You're probably gonna need this too," the man said with a smile. And I felt my cheeks turn red from embarrassment. I had completely forgotten about the charging cable, and I awkwardly walked back up to him as he handed it to me and shook my hand. "I'll let you keep that for free," he said with a chuckle. I then nodded before speed walking to the truck. My father was waiting there, and I got in his pickup and then closed the door. I put on my seatbelt and I held the laptop close to my chest as we drove off. Once we were home, I went to my bedroom with my laptop to mess around with it and get comfortable using it. But after a few minutes, I realized that the man hadn't deleted any of his personal files from the laptop. I was going to delete them then and there, but something caught my eye. It was a folder simply labeled as Future Famil, and then it got off. I assumed that the incomplete word was family, but future family? That didn't make any sense. The preview in the folder had trees in it, so it probably wasn't anything about family planning, was it? Feeling guilty about snooping around through such a nice man's private photos, but I was curious as to what it meant. I opened the folder, and what I saw was a picture of a woman sitting in a park. She wasn't really facing the camera. If anything, she didn't acknowledge its existence. A very artsy pose, I guess. I pressed the arrow key to the next photo, in which the same woman, or at least I think it was the same woman, was walking down a street and her back was to the camera. Why would someone take a picture of her walking down the street? I moved to the next photo. This one was a photo of her, still in the same outfit at a door, hunched over it as if she was unlocking her door to get into the house. Given that there was less lighting in this photo, I would assume that it was evening. The photo was taken from far away. About a quarter of the image was covered by a wall, as if the photographer was hiding behind it as they took the photo. This is starting to get creepy. Was the old dude who sold me this stalker or something? Thoughts of what happened to this poor woman filled my mind as I continued to look through the photos. One of her eating at a cafe, another of her working at a store, a few of her in a library. Then, another which scared me more than all the others combined. A picture of this brown-haired woman, asleep in her bed. He got into her home. What was he going to do with her? What did he do to her? And with a lump in my throat, I pressed the right arrow key again to find a picture of her with a man. Was it him? It looked kind of like him. This time, the woman was smiling at the camera alongside the man, only for the next one to be of her sleeping again. As I filtered through the photos, there were photos of them together, at first scarcely, but as I moved further through them, there were more and more photos of them together. Then, at the near end of the photos, at picture 352 of 364, was a picture of the woman showing off a wedding ring to the camera, followed by one of them together and a few wedding photos, and lastly, a picture of the two of them holding a newborn child. Their newborn child. I felt a pang of guilt once more, but at this point, the man had aged to the point in which I couldn't tell if he was indeed the same person who sold me the laptop. He was his wife's stalker. I felt conflicted as to what I should do. I can't just leave this information to myself, right? But what would I even say? Would I say, hello ma'am, sorry to bother you, but your husband actually stalked you before you two started dating each other? I looked back at the last photo as the small child in the photo, and I remembered hearing a kid's voice from inside their house, probably a toddler, given the date of the photo. And with a deep breath, I did a system wipe of all the data on the laptop before going to dinner, just hoping to forget it. And fortunately, it's been nearly 8 years since then, and I still haven't gotten it out of my mind. Did I do the right thing? Hi, I'm Lisa and I'm 27 and female. I've been on this subreddit for a while now, and I've decided to share my own story. This happened 5 years ago. I had recently moved into my new apartment, which was further from my job, but given my lack of driver's license and how dodgy the public transport is in Detroit, I decided to just get a bike, since it wouldn't be too far. So, I opened my laptop and I started browsing Craigslist for a used bike to see if I could get any good deals. After finding a few I was interested in, I decided to give the owners a call. The first one had recently sold his bike and had yet to take the ad down, but the second bike I was interested in was available. I asked about the condition it was in, and the seller offered to let me see it in person before I made any sort of deal. I agreed and I told him that I'd be there tomorrow at around 4 p.m. to look at the bike and then make my decision. And so the next day at 4, I arrived at his residence. It was a small flat with a silver car parked in the driveway. I walked up to the door and I rang the doorbell. And after a few seconds, a man opened the door. He was a tall, thin man with shoulder-length brown hair. He was wearing a white shirt with a stain on it, as well as a pair of jeans. "Hi," I said. "I'm here to see the bike. Are you Carl by any chance?" And the man smiled and said yes before exiting his household, and then he closed the door behind him. As he led me to his garage, he kept looking back at me. He said, "You know, you're pretty cute, Lisa." I didn't really know how to respond to that, so I tried to change the subject by asking about the bike. He opened the garage to reveal a cluttered space, and from it, he pulled out the bike and rolled it into the yard. "For your viewing pleasure, beautiful." Of course, I was really weirded out, but the bike looked really good for the price he was asking, so I just grit my teeth and bared it as I checked the state of the bicycle. After inspecting the bike, it seemed to be in really good condition, and with my mind made up, I turned to him and asked if he was still okay with the price he posted. But as I turned, I noticed him really close to my face. I flinched and I backed up a bit, but he didn't even react. He stared me dead in the eyes and said, "Well, how about this? You go on a date with me, and I'll give it to you for free." I was starting to get a really bad vibe from him, so I fished out the $50 from my purse and I handed it to him, hoping that he would get the message. But he barely acknowledged it. "Does Saturday sound good to you? I'll pick you up." He clearly wasn't taking the hint, so I took another step back from him and I said in a firm voice, "No, thank you. I'm not interested." And I handed him the money. He stared at me for a moment, and in that silence I felt scared. We were alone in his yard, and he was standing between me and the road, and he was much bigger than me. Thankfully, he let out a sigh and then took the money. With that said and done, I took the bike and walked it out of his property as fast as I could before getting on and cycling away. And as I did, I vaguely heard him saying, "See you later, Lisa," as I sped off, but I didn't really care. All I cared about was putting as much distance as I could between me and him. Once I had made it to my block, I felt the comforting sense of home. Feeling protected, I pulled in, but that was just wishful thinking. As I parked it at the bike rack for my apartment and I walked up to my room, I realized that my phone had been going off the whole time, and given that I was writing and in a less ideal mindset, I probably just didn't notice it until now. When I checked my phone, I saw 9 text messages from Carl Euler. My heart dropped. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I checked what he texted me, and I realized now my mistake. But at that time, I wasn't thinking about anything other than what kind of weirdo I just bought a bike from. And as I opened them, a little checkmark appeared below his message. My eyes grew wide as I came to the realization that he now knew that I had looked at them. He sent another text, a simple, "See you Saturday." I immediately scrolled up to see what he wrote. "Hey, it's Carl. So, are we still on for this weekend? I know, you're just trying to start things out on the wrong foot and not take advantage of me. You're so thoughtful. But I don't mind. I know you're a good girl who's gonna treat me right. I'll be sure to treat you for the $50 though. Are you still on your way home? Lisa? And then, the last text after he saw that I checked them, it said, "See you Saturday." I blocked the number and hoped that that would be the end of it. And I spent the next few days trying to forget about it. But his last message, "See you Saturday," was stuck in the back of my mind. That morning, I looked out of my door suspiciously. He doesn't know where I live, but paranoia seemed to be getting the better of me. And seeing nothing, I chastised myself for being so childish, and I went on my way to the store. It was only on my way back did I realize that my fear was right. Right there, on the front of my apartment building was Carl. He was just standing there on his phone. That was until he saw me. A wide smile spread across his face as he looked at me and said, "Lisa, hey, I'm here for our date. Did you get my text?" he said as he walked towards me. I unconsciously backed away, shaking my head no and holding my grocery bags tightly. I could feel myself shaking as he approached me. But just as he approached me, I heard another voice from behind me. "Hey, is there a problem here?" I turned my head slightly to the left to see my neighbor Daniel walking up beside me. He looked at me with concern before looking back to Carl. "No problem, just here for my date," he said, looking expectantly at me. And no longer alone, I slightly felt safer, and I said aloud, "No, I don't want to go on a date with you. Please, leave me alone." I tried standing a bit taller to sound more stern, but Carl wasn't having that. Come on, Lisa, don't be like that," he said, trying to get closer, but as he took a step, Daniel moved in front of me, looking him dead in the face. "You heard her, buddy. She's not interested." Daniel was a pretty big guy with a good build, so he was towering over Carl as they locked eyes. And after a few agonizing seconds, Carl nodded before leaving. Me and Daniel both let out a sigh of relief as he turned the corner on the block before he turned and asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, and after that, I never saw Carl again, and I hope that I never will. This all happened back somewhere around 2017. I had just turned 18 that year, and I was trying to save up money to get my own place. And not necessarily because I wanted to, but because I was the youngest of 4 boys, and I think my parents were at a point where they just really wanted me out of the house. Not trying to complain about my parents, but they were a bit pushy about me getting money and getting the hell out. I had a job, it just didn't pay well, and I was still trying to figure out what I was going to do for college, about my career, and all of that. Honestly, it's not important, but it kind of frames what was going on in my life. Because my parents wanted me gone, and they had given me a pretty tight time frame as to when they wanted me out, I was doing almost anything that I could to get money. It was around Christmas time, and thankfully, I did have a few avenues to get money saved up. Like I said, I had my job, and that was covering most of the necessary expenses. And every time anyone asked what I wanted for Christmas, my response was, $50. Mostly joking, of course. That said, I also had a few things that I could sell, but that was supposed to be my last resort. The week before Christmas, I kind of hit that last resort. Like I mentioned, my parents wanted me out pretty quickly, and they were pushing for me to find a place the first week of January. I was getting there, but I needed a little bit more. So, I moved on to selling my electronics, which is something an 18-year-old never wants to do. I sold my old laptop for $100, and I sold my brother's old Nintendo consoles for a bit of money. And I ended up at a point where I was listing my PS4 Pro, which was my prized possession. Thankfully, they were harder to find in my area, so I was able to list it on Craigslist for $500 with the extra controllers and a few games, and I was willing to be talked down to $400 if it really came down to it. I only needed about $200 at this point, but it's obviously better to have more than what you need in these situations. Within a couple hours of me listing it, I got several messages from people that were obviously scammers and spammers. But there were also a few people messaging me asking if they could get it for $100 because they had a sick kid that really needed it for Christmas and it could be their last one. Look, I'm all about helping out sick kids, but using that as a reason to talk a seller down to 20% of their asking price is just really low. I got another message from one guy that asked if I was willing to come down a bit on the price. I assume it was going to be another sob story about a sick kid, and he was going to try to lowball me hard. It seemed like that's how it was going to go when he mentioned it was something that he wanted so he could play some games with his 8-year-old daughter and her mother. But then, he actually came back with a modest request. $50 off. He would be able to give me $450 in cash that day if I was willing to meet up with him in public. I know, it's not smart to just take the first good-sounding offer. But within 4 hours, I had gotten over a dozen sob stories and twice as many bots. I was seriously done with this already. I responded and told him that it was his, and I asked where he wanted to meet up. He responds thanking me and telling me that they would be able to meet me up in a parking lot of a hotel that was around 5 or so miles away from where I lived. I was a bit confused on why he would want to meet in a hotel parking lot, but at the same time, I wasn't about to question the choice. It was still in public, and hotels have cameras. Plus, there would likely be people around. I packed up the system with the extras all nicely in a box. I tossed it in my passenger seat, and I told my mom where I was going, and then I headed out. I got out to the hotel in question, and I parked. Then I messaged the guy saying that I was there and to let me know when he gets there. He responds saying that they're actually staying there for the night and that he would be right down. They asked if I could bring it into the lobby, and at that point meeting here made a lot more sense. And while I was a bit iffy on walking across the parking lot into the lobby with an expensive console, I had parked pretty close to the front, so I risked it. I got into the lobby with a box, and the front desk asked if they could help me, and I told them that I was just meeting someone that was staying there. I sat down, and I waited for a few minutes. Then, I saw a guy exit the elevator that looked like he was looking for someone. I correctly assumed that it was the guy. We did the customary greetings and moved forward to the transaction. He opened the box, looked over the items, and remarked that they all looked new. And I told him that I had bought it a while back and that I was the only one that ever played it, and that I was really paranoid about keeping the stuff clean. I mentioned that I had even opened the case and blew out the dust before I listed it, so it was in near perfect condition. I showed him the disc for the games that I had listed, then also mentioned that I was throwing in my copies of Crash and Kingdom Hearts for his little one because I know she'd probably like them. He thanked me and said that he really appreciated it. Honestly, this transaction was going super smooth for our whole conversation, and I thought it was going to be a quick sale. He pulls out his wallet and pulls the cash out, and I see 400 bills. He then mentions to me that he had the full 150, but they had to spend the 50 on pizza for lunch, and that because of that, he was a bit short. And then he says something that I really did not expect, and this is going to be verbatim because I don't want to paraphrase and have this come across as less creepy than it was. He said, and again, "I'm sorry, I'm $50 short, but my girlfriend and my daughter are up in the room, and I'd be willing to let you spend some time with them if you would give me a discount." I want to further emphasize that this guy mentioned his 8-year-old daughter in this context. It wasn't just, "Hey, wanna spend time with my adult girlfriend?" It was girlfriend and daughter. This guy was willing to sell his girlfriend and their child for $50 for personal time. I really don't know what else to say about this all, honestly. The whole thing left me at a loss for words. Pimping out your girlfriend for $50 off a PS4 was gross, sure. But then, including your young daughter in that context was a new level of disturbing. And after a few seconds of just kind of staring at him, and him staring at me, I guess waiting for an answer, I just said, 400 is fine. And I put my hand out. He handed me the cash and said thank you, and I just said yeah, and I turned to leave and put this event behind me. Honestly, I didn't know what to do after this. I don't know if he was being serious or if he had just said that to get a discount because who in the right mind would accept that? Or maybe if it was a weird sting, and if I had said yes, I would have been jumped or arrested. Out of all the possibilities, the worst one, and the one that seriously haunts me, is the one where this was an honest offer. It scares the hell out of me to think that this guy was being serious. And that's the end of it. I told my parents and they didn't seem to really care. I didn't report it to the cops because I didn't know what to tell them. I got the money together and I moved out, and I have been on my own ever since. I really hope that that guy wasn't serious, but if he was, I am so very sorry that I never did anything more, and that, as an ignorant and confused kid myself, I didn't know what to do in this situation. I'm a male, and when I was 25, I had finally gotten to a place in my life where I could start pursuing my passions while supporting myself after I had moved out. Feeling like now was the right time to pick up a hobby, I checked Craigslist for a guitar. I had always wanted to learn how to play, and now that I had the time and money to invest into it, I wanted to get started right away. Of course, I wasn't gonna buy a brand new one. Money wasn't tight, but a good guitar can cost a lot of money. And since it's my first one, it's better to take used instruments first. So, if anything happens due to my newness, I wouldn't have lost hundreds of dollars. Searching Craigslist, I had found one that seemed to be in good condition that wasn't too far from me, and after contacting the seller, I confirmed that it was still available, and according to him, the guitar was only in good condition. And while I didn't know anything about guitars, I did still want to go in person to check it out. After all, It was only a few blocks away and I wouldn't even have to drive. I arranged a meeting with the vendor, Mitchell, to see it tomorrow, and I went about my day. The next day, as I was driving back from work, I stopped by Mitchell's house and I knocked on his door. I was greeted by a pregnant woman with long brown hair wearing a polka dot dress. Hi, is this Mitchell's house? I asked. I'm actually here to look at the guitar that's for sale, I added. The woman nodded and smiled at me before calling to someone from the inside. A man with short hair and a red shirt, whom I assume was Mitchell, came to the door behind her. She informed him that I was here to see the guitar, and then went back inside with a smile. The man then looked at me as he stepped outside. He gestured with a nod towards the garage, which he opened to reveal a rather crowded space. The wife wants to make some room for when the baby gets here, he said. His voice seemed melancholy, with a hint of a southern accent to it. And the money will probably help too. But despite what he said, he seemed depressed as he looked at the piles of stuff in the garage. Everything from rifles to tools to boxes labeled Pokemon was there. And as he took a few steps in to bring out the guitar case, he brought it back to the front of the garage and set it down before opening it. It revealed an orange, woody acoustic guitar. I'm sorry, I'm not really good at describing guitars. She's a beauty, the man said. It's a shame I gotta let her go. He looked at the instrument up and down. A damn shame. I stood there awkwardly while he gazed at it. So, would you take 100 for it? Mitchell looked up at me with conflict in his eyes. 125? I shyly suggested, and with a deep breath, Mitchell shook my hand, still looking at the guitar. With that said and done, I paid him the money and closed the case before walking back to my car. As I was walking back, Mitchell just stood there in the driveway looking at me, even until I got inside my car and drove just a few blocks away. His eyes followed me. The rest of the day was pretty normal. I spent the first few hours goofing around with the guitar, randomly plucking strings, vaguely to the melody of the McDonald's jingle and such, before checking where I can get lessons. After the initial hype of having a guitar died down, I made dinner, watched some TV, and I searched the internet for a few hours before finally falling asleep. Unfortunately, I awoke to a loud crashing sound. I could hear what I can only assume to be shards of glass sliding across the floor as loud thudding footsteps stomped across my home. I immediately got up and I snuck to my door, hoping whoever it was didn't come this way. I locked my bedroom door and then immediately called the police. 911, what's your emergency? And after explaining my situation, they then instructed me to hide in the closet and stay on the line with them. He then assured me that the police would be there soon, and my goal was simply to stay out of sight until the intruder was gone or until the police arrives. After a few minutes, the crashing stopped, but I remained hidden, just like the operator told me, and after a few more, I heard the sirens. Then came a loud banging on my door as a man's voice told me to open the door, saying that it was the police. At that point, I slowly crawled out of my closet and I unlocked the door. They led me out of my home. Then, I saw the porch window shattered, but other than that, there wasn't anything you'd think wrong. After talking to the police and having them take a statement, They asked if I had any place to stay, and after calling my parents and explaining what happened, they escorted me there while they investigated the crime scene. After taking inventory of my belongings, no cash or valuables were missing. The only thing that was missing, however, was my guitar. Now, I'm not sure what happened, to be honest, if it was Mitchell or just a random home invader, but because of it, I've been too scared to ever buy anything on Craigslist ever since. This happened last June, and back in those days, I was a motorcyclist. I bought my bike after I graduated, and I used to ride it at every chance that I got. I didn't even have a direction in mind. I just loved riding. I was riding one evening, and I knew that I had a day off on the following day, so I felt like going kind of far. I had a good night out riding, and I decided to head home sometime after midnight. I was on my way back towards Setagaya in Tokyo. The roads were not so busy, and I was taking it easy. Then, as if all of a sudden, the car in front stopped. It stopped at such a speed that it collided with a guardrail. I was shocked to see an accident happen right before my eyes, and to be honest, I was kinda scared. I had no other choice but to pull over and try to figure out what happened. I raced over to the driver's side window, and I saw that the driver was a female. She was visibly distressed, and she couldn't stop shaking her head, and her hands were firmly clamped onto the steering wheel. Oh, this is bad, I thought to myself. I started off by asking if she was all right in a gentle tone as I could muster, and I waited a few seconds, but she didn't reply to my question. I started to panic. This was serious, and I realized that I should call the police, and so I did. While waiting for the police, I asked several times if the woman was all right, and eventually, she got out of the car. She didn't look hurt, but her skin had gone very pale, and almost to the point that it looked blue. She was muttering something. I couldn't make it out what she was saying, so I leaned my ear close to her mouth, and she kept murmuring, What have I done? What have I done? I could hear the tremble in her voice, and then, as if in an answer to her own question, she said something. I've run over a child. I've run over a child. I've run over a child. She kept repeating these words. Her voice gathered strength and volume, and it was very hard to listen to her panicked wails. I was deeply disturbed, and it was a frightening situation. Then I remembered that I was behind her, and I didn't see a child in the road. I was certain that there was no one around. Plus, it was the dead of night. I looked back and I couldn't see a child anywhere. I sat with that woman and I tried to calm her down for a while, but occasionally I stood up and I went in search of the child that she thought she had hit with her car. There were no children in the area. A few moments later, the police arrived, and I spoke with one of the officers, and he searched with me for this child. The officer asked me about what had happened repeatedly, and I repeatedly told him that all I saw was the lady in front swerve and then hit the guardrail. I said that I didn't see anyone on the road. The officer went and asked the woman about what had happened, and I went with him to listen. According to the woman, she saw a young child dart out into the road ahead of her car, and she heard and felt the collision. But no matter what we did and no matter where we searched, we couldn't find the child. The officer started back towards his patrol car while talking into his radio, and the woman was looking around the road absent-mindedly, and I watched as her eyes fell on the roadside mirror. You know those mirrors that you sometimes see in the rural areas that allow you to see oncoming traffic around the bends? They're a circular type, and they are usually on a pole high enough for the driver to see but not be distracted. I think they are sometimes known as convex mirrors. Well, that's what she looked at, and the moment she laid her eyes on it, a terrible scream rose from the pit of her stomach. The officer was shocked as I was to hear this, and he rushed over to her. Noticed that she was looking at the roadside mirror. I came over to look as well, and we looked into the mirror and saw a child in the road. There was no one there when we looked without the help of the mirror, but when we looked into the mirror, the child was there. It was the strangest thing that I have ever seen, and I couldn't believe my eyes. The child looked to be about 4 or 5 years old. She was wearing a kindergarten uniform, looked like the kid went to a good school, and that child stared at us with an utterly expressionless look on her face. The police officer and I turned to look at the road almost simultaneously, and there was no child in the road. We looked back at the mirror, and we could only see ourselves and the female driver sat on the side of the road. Our faces looked incredibly pale, and our mouths hung open in shock. The woman then exploded into a full-blown state of panic, and the ambulance that was intended for the child took the woman away. And before she went, she asked me for my contact information, saying she might call me to ask about what had happened again, and the officer said that for her sake, it wouldn't be a good idea, and it would be better to forget about the incident entirely. His face was also as white as snow. I insisted that the officer should take my information, but there was to be no further contact from anyone that I met that day. I am sorry, but it has left me very confused and troubled. I think about it often. What really happened that day is a mystery to me, but I believe that I had a run-in with a paranormal, and that little girl's spirit still remains in the spot that she might have met her final moments.
I've been a police officer for somewhere close to a decade, and I've spent a significant portion of my career out on the road making sure that people out there aren't doing anything too crazy. For the most part, the job is pretty boring, which I guess is one of those don't look a gift horse in the mouth kind of things. If my job wasn't boring, it would probably be a lot more dangerous. I pretty much just drive around and make sure people aren't breaking the law, or respond to calls that come in nearby. I've had a few run-ins with crazy situations, sure, but really, for the most part, everything is fairly routine. That all holds true until you get thrown onto the night shift. The minute you get into the car and out onto the road after the sun goes down, things get a bit more hectic, and a lot more unpredictable. Sure, things have a certain level of standard. However, there are far more moments where things do get out of hand. Most nights involve calls where people think that someone's in their home, or people calling to say that the neighbors left their garage door open. But some of the things you run into do absolutely get crazy. There was one night that I was driving on my patrol and things were going pretty standard. I had issued a couple of tickets and responded to 1 or 2 calls that were pretty uneventful. I then got a call asking to check out a business alarm at a local strip mall, and was headed towards said alarm when I saw what looked like a young child standing on the side of the road. I slowed my car down and made sure that I wasn't just going crazy or seeing things, and sure enough, on the side of the highway on-ramp there was a small child, They couldn't have been much older than 6 or 7. I pulled over, grabbed my radio, calling in that I was stopping at a potential emergency, informing them that there was a child out near the highway and that they would need to send someone else to the business alarm. They asked if I needed more units at my location, and I informed them that I wasn't sure at that moment. Obviously, we're trained to keep calm in situations like this, and to try and control ourselves, but my mind was honestly racing. It was a bit after midnight at this point. Why was there a child walking on the road by the highway? Where were his parents? Was this some kind of runaway situation? I flicked my lights on to try and get the kid's attention, and I jumped out to go find him. As soon as I got onto the shoulder of the road, I heard this kid sobbing somewhere a bit back. I sped up my pace and called out to see if the kid would run over to me once I got his attention. The second that he heard my voice shout over to him, I could hear him crying louder and yelling out to me asking for help. This made me jump into action more than I already had. The kid being out there was confusing at first, for sure, but instead of him just being there and upset, he was now calling out for help. This told me that something else was going on here. As I ran back toward where the kid was, I called into my radio for dispatch and told them to send a second unit to this location and to have medical on standby just in case. When I got over to the little boy and knelt down to try to ask what was going on, I noticed that he had blood on his shirt, and he did look a little cut up. The poor kid was just sitting there sobbing and yelling something incoherently. I let him get it out a bit before I told him to calm down and asked him what was going on. After a short bit of back and forth, he started saying things that made sense, but were dreadful to hear. The first thing he said that I was able to make sense of was car crash. As soon as those 2 words came out of his mouth, my ears perked up, and I was kind of starting to piece things together. I asked him if he was in a car crash, and he shook his head yes. I asked him if he was in the car with his parents, and he again nodded, and then mentioned that his dad was driving, and they somehow got into an accident. This is what I was expecting, and honestly not wanting to hear. I grabbed my radio and told the dispatch to get medical out here, and as I was calling it in, my backup pulled up to the scene. As he approached, I told him that we may have an accident with an unconscious occupant somewhere, and that the occupant was likely to be this child's father. I went back to the little boy and asked him if the accident happened nearby, and if he could show me. He said yes, and then pointed over toward where there was a ravine by the entry ramp. I stood up and walked over toward where the dip was, and I shined my light down into the ditch, and sure enough, there was a small sedan lying upside down at the bottom. This is where things really jumped into motion. I called over to the other officer, and I informed him to take the child away from the scene, to call for more backup, and to get medical down into the ravine as soon as they got there. And I then told him that there was a vehicle down in said ravine. From here, it was mostly adrenaline, and I don't remember everything that happened. The most I recall was that I ran down into the ditch and searched the car, and saw an unconscious man buckled into the driver's seat. I know that I was pulling at the door and trying everything I could to get him out of the car, and then medical showed up and took over. At the end, as things got pieced together, it all fell into place, and I learned exactly what had happened. Apparently, this man had to go somewhere, and he didn't want to leave his son home alone, so he decided that he wanted to take him with him. Unfortunately, with it being as late as it was, he was apparently starting to doze off while driving, and he had done so while he was entering onto the highway from the ramp. When he did, he ended up going over the side and flipping his car down into the ravine. thankfully through some miracle from above. When the car flipped, neither of them were killed. The father had some moderate injuries, a concussion, and his son had a few scratches, scrapes, and bruises, but nothing that was life-threatening or anything like that. And like I said, it had to have been a miracle that neither of them were killed or seriously injured, and I'm beyond glad of the fact that I happened to be driving by at that exact moment that I needed to be. However, I think this experience should hold strong as a testament for why you should never get out on the road while you're tired, unless absolutely necessary. In this situation, no one was seriously injured, but I have absolutely seen wrecks at night where the people were not so lucky. As an officer, I have to say, please, be careful out there, and make sure that you're awake and aware when you get behind the wheel.
I was driving when it happened. It made local news, so I want to keep names and locations out of it. I was driving with my wife and we were heading off for a summer camping trip. The night was full of sound of crickets and cicadas, and there was a fair degree of humidity in the air. We were going up through the mountainous woods, and despite it being the height of summer, it was dark out in the shade of the giant rocks. To be honest, it was our first trip away as a married couple after the honeymoon. I mean, we did a tons of family stuff and thank yous to our friends. It was nice to do something alone. Just us, and to be frank, I was more than looking forward to that idea. While passing along a bridge, my wife suddenly shouted, "Someone just jumped into the river!" I pulled over and looked in the direction she was pointing. We got out and had a look around, and I noticed that there was a bicycle leaning against the railings, and there were a pair of shoes neatly positioned facing towards the river. What the hell were they doing? Night swimming? Or something much more fatal, perhaps? And when I got close to the guard railing at the end of the road, I realized how high up the bridge was. There must have been about a 20 to 30 feet drop below. Excitement surrounding our trip disappeared into the night air, as now there was a grave situation in front of us. The authorities needed to be contacted. It was a big fuss. The police and the fire department turned up in a hurry and tried to search the river. We were told that we were not allowed to leave until the police had conducted their investigation. We were being detained. I started to think that we were being treated more like suspects than witnesses. I was so bored of sitting by the side of the road waiting for it to be all over. Sorry if that sounds selfish, but I was really looking forward to my trip. And a few hours passed, and then someone reported that they had discovered a body downstream in the river. He didn't make it, it was obvious. After witnessing that poor person's final moments and being questioned for hours, we were finally free. But that night's incidences left us both depressed and disheartened. When we got to our destination, we wanted nothing more than some shut-eye, so we headed to bed. The next morning, I had a little Google to see if there were any further details announced regarding the man on the bridge. I couldn't find much, but later the police called. I learned something shocking through my conversation with a detective. He suspected that the shoes were placed there intentionally and not by the man who jumped. He asked my wife and I if we saw anyone in the area nearby when we approached. I didn't see anyone, and my wife said that she didn't either. I asked why it was so important, and he said that the reason why it was so important was because the man who had supposedly jumped had been dead for at least a week before his body was anywhere near that bridge. We were floored by that. It wasn't a suicide, but a murder. Then I remember the bicycle which was resting against the guardrail. Perhaps the person who tossed that body into the river was in the same area as we were while we were calling the police. They could have been watching us, or was that part of the staging of the scene? What if we didn't call the police? Would we have been in danger? Come to think of it, I wasn't able to recall if the bike remained there until we left. Perhaps, before the police came, someone used it to hightail it out of there. There are various interpretations of what happened that night, and it's a night that we can't ever forget.
This actually happened to me last week, and I'm still kind of freaking out about it in my head and trying to process what I saw. I live in an apartment complex that was recently built, like within the last year. And they started tearing down a patch of trees that blocked the highway on the other side to build this place, so it disrupted some wildlife, I'm sure. The town I live in doesn't have much in the way of multi-dwelling homes, like apartments. It's been more for retirees and senior living, so besides moving away, this was one of the cheapest places to live other than a house, so that's why I chose it. Besides the fact that it was close to my mom and my job. So, to get to the complex, you have to take a road that was basically made to get to this place. It's pretty long because it sits back in that carved out field, and since it's still surrounded by some trees, you can still see a bit of wildlife. When I'm driving, I typically go slower down the road because I see deer, possums, squirrels, and even a few feral cats cross it. It's beautiful at my apartment too because sitting out on the balcony, I get a view of the trees. And sometimes I can see deer in there or a bunch of birds flying around. One of my neighbors actually has bird and squirrel feeders that she not only put by her patio, but also closer to the trees, so they were away from the people. It's a nice view. Anyways, this happened when I was driving home from my mom's place late one night. I went there to have dinner after work since I was off later, and she invited me over, so I didn't have to spend money on food. I could never say no to her cooking anyways. It was about 9 or so when I left, and I was already feeling tired. As I was driving back, I was trying my hardest to focus as the lights dimmed when I went between the streetlights. At one point, I saw something on all 4 legs crossing the road, so I started slowing down. As I came to a stop, I really got a better look at the animal, and I was horrified. My car was just a bit in front of the light where the animal was on the other side of it. Based on what I could see in the light and its shape, I could tell it was a deer. But there was something horribly wrong with it. What I thought at first was mud or something in its fur had to be blood and flesh. It looked like all the fur on that side of the body was gone, and I was just looking at skin. The only way I can think to describe it was like that side of its body had been scraped off. Its leg was the same way, and in fact, I'm pretty sure I could see part of the leg bone and its jawbone. I was panicking in my head, thinking that something obviously happened to this thing, and it was going to collapse right in front of me. Instead, it just stood there, staring at me, as if there was nothing wrong with it. In fact, it didn't even seem intimidated or scared of me at all. Still confused about what I was seeing, though, and since it wasn't moving, I decided to get out of my car and try to get closer. The minute I opened my door and started walking around it, the smell hit me. It was the smell of decay and rot. I felt like I was going to be sick, so I pulled my shirt up over my nose to try to mask the smell. I got a little closer, and I could confirm that I was definitely seeing raw flesh. I really don't understand how this deer was alive and even standing in front of me. I said something under my breath like, "What the hell?" or something to that effect, and that's when the deer started backing up. I didn't know what it would do or could do being injured to that extent, so I backed up to give it space. And that's when I heard a loud plop coming from the trees on the right, where the deer was walking from. Within the time it took me to look in that direction, the deer bolted across the road and took off. I watched it for a few seconds as it ran away without as much as a limp, when I heard another sound coming from the opposite side. It sounded like something big was falling to the ground, like out of the tree. At this point, that putrid smell of death was still lingering, and I was getting this overwhelming sense of dread, so I ran back to my car, locking the doors, and I just sat there looking into the trees. That's when I saw something moving around in the trees that very clearly was not a deer. It was trying to walk on all four, but the movement wasn't right. It was choppy and very uncoordinated. It almost reminded me of a fawn trying to walk for the first time, as well as maybe a human trying to walk with their hands. And the back was very rigid and curved. I had no clue what I was looking at, but it terrified me, so I took off. I've never driven that fast down the road, but I knew that I didn't want to be there anymore, and maybe even wasn't supposed to be there. When I got home, I looked around before getting out of my car, and when it looked safe, I made a mad dash to the building, pulling the door shut, and then running up the stairs to my place and quickly locking the door. I went and looked out my balcony door to see if I could see anything on that side of the woods, which was opposite from the one I was at. So I didn't really expect to see anything, but was still paranoid and scared. When I didn't see anything, I took some time to try and calm myself down and called my dad to talk to him about it. As expected, he told me the deer was probably in some kind of accident and was in shock and probably died shortly after my encounter with him. I tried to stay reasonable and keep that in my mind, but then I was confused about the big thing trying to imitate a deer. However, I didn't tell my dad about that one. I figured he would probably just think I was seeing things. I haven't told anyone else about this until now because it's still nightmare fuel for me. I want to be reasonable and say that maybe it was just another deer with some kind of weird deformity, but was it? Was that really what I saw? Or is there something more sinister in those woods? All I know is I haven't seen it since, thankfully, and I don't stop like that anymore at night, no matter what road I'm on.
I was out late driving the other night. I was heading home, and I think it was about midnight. To get back to my place, I have to go through some winding dark mountain roads. They're always kind of spooky in the middle of the night, but that night, something else terrified me. I rounded a bend in the road and had to slam on the brakes. There was a woman in the middle of the road with her arms outstretched in a stop kind of gesture. She was blocking the road. I didn't like the situation, but I had no choice but to stop. When my car came to a standstill, she approached. She gestured for me to roll down the window, and I obliged. She asked me for a ride. According to the woman's story, she had been left behind by a boyfriend of hers. They had an argument, and he told her to get out. And apparently, she didn't even have a chance to get her purse. She was saying that she couldn't even call her parents to get her because her phone was in her boyfriend's car. I instantly felt sorry for her, but I also thought to myself, why do I have to give her a lift? Then another thought crept into my mind. what if this is fake? There is no guarantee that what she told me was even remotely true. It did kind of seem like a well-rehearsed story. Everything was covered, no phone, no wallet, and the reason for her being alone out here. I had my suspicions that she wasn't alone out here, and her role was to stop my car. I felt like that there could be people hiding by the sides of the road in the trees and bushes, waiting for their moment. Maybe I would be kidnapped or something, or maybe this is some kind of police thing. I have seen too many movies to know that whatever this was didn't seem legitimate. Something else was happening now, and she was really escalating. She was close to tears and pleading for me, but her performance didn't seem genuine. It felt a little forced, and a little studied and unnatural. No matter how I looked at the situation, I couldn't convince myself that it was a good idea to let this woman in my car or to turn the engine off. I had to reply though. I tried my best to turn her down politely. I felt like a real piece of shit, but something was sketchy about the situation. She wanted my phone. I knew that was the only thing I had, which gave me communication to others. I needed it. But also, if I was to believe her story, she needed it right now just as much as I did. It was the only thing that wouldn't get her off the road too if I didn't give her a ride, and she didn't accept no for an answer. When she started looking around while she was yelling at me, I realized that it was time to go. I guess she could have been signaling to someone that I couldn't see. There was no way that I was giving her my phone. It was recording the whole thing, and I thought that I would need a video and audio for my insurance company if something was about to go down. I started honking my horn at her and slowly edging forward. She threw herself on my bonnet but then eventually let go, and I pulled away slowly and looked back in my rearview mirror. I looked back to see her calmly sit down in the middle of the road. It looked like she was already waiting for the next driver to come along. That was another weird thing. If I was in her shoes, I would at least attempt walking back towards a town, or a city, a house, or anything. I began to grow fearful for the next driver who would approach. I called the police and let them know about the situation, and then I headed home. The next day after work, I took the recording and put it on my computer as a backup in case I was ever asked for it. I spoke with my girlfriend about it, and she hated my guts for not picking that woman up. She was so angry at me. I was accused of being inhumane and for being plain cruel. But I still stand by my actions. It wasn't worth risking my life. The risk was too great. What's done is done, and I don't care if I am thought of as cruel or even a coward. I was there and no one else but that woman, who knows better than me about the situation. What a minefield of a situation it was.
Back when I was fresh out of high school, I used to be a pizza delivery driver for a certain pizza place that is open really late. Like, way later than it needs to be. I admit that delivering pizzas at like 1 a.m. is a genius way to get business from drunks and stoners, but I also have to say that the pace sucked, and I was never more tired than the 9 months that I worked at that place. This experience was a few months back, but thinking about it and how it could have gone, it seriously makes me feel like I want to get sick. I won't. I'll push through getting the story written out, but it really does cause a bit of panic in me. It was a pretty typical Friday night. I was nearing the end of my shift and was actually on my last delivery from a triple that was thrown on me by my jerk of a manager who knew that I was about to leave. This being my last delivery, it was the furthest out of the 3. And it was definitely in a more spread out and remote part of our town. I don't live in a big city, but it's fairly concentrated with houses that circle the epicenter, and then there are the neighborhoods that are spread out in every direction. This delivery was in one of those out on the edge neighborhoods. I pulled up to the house after circling the neighborhood a couple of times trying to find the numbers, which, tangent, if you order pizza delivery, please turn on your lights so that we can see your house numbers. Anyways, I circled a couple of times, found the house, and grabbed the pizza to walk it up to the front door. The house looked decent. It wasn't run down or anything, it was just really dark. Like maybe the occupant was in bed, or not home. Which, yes, did make me feel a bit uneasy about this delivery, though it wouldn't have been the first time that I had taken a delivery to a drunk person that had passed out after putting it in. I knocked a few times, but no answer. I pulled out my cell phone, and I called the number on the order, but it was disconnected. At this point, I assumed that the delivery was either a prank or the aforementioned drunk person. I sent my boss a text message saying, knocked, no answer, phone disconnected, heading back, and walked back to my car. I tossed the pizza bag into the back seat on the passenger side and started to walk to the other side of my car to get in, when I started hearing footsteps come up from the side. My dumb self thought that maybe it was the customer coming out to say, "Hey, sorry, I fell asleep, can I get my pizza?" But of course it wasn't. No. Instead it was a man wearing a pink hoodie, dark jogging pants, and walking straight towards me with a gun pointed in my direction. I put my hands up and immediately braced for him to rob me, but after a moment, he finally spoke up and said, "Keys, now." I nodded, reached into my pocket, and handed the guy my keys. And after a few moments of my heart racing and my face being drenched in sweat, he motions towards the car and says, "Get in the passenger seat." At first I was thinking I was about to die, and then I was thinking that I could try to run as I got around the car, but again, where was I going to go? I was in the middle of a mostly empty cul-de-sac. Nowhere to go but open fields, and he could easily put a round in my back if I ran. At this point, I realized I had no choice but to follow what he wanted me to do. I quickly complied with his demands, and I got in the passenger seat of the car, thinking that this was seriously going to be my final few moments. He got in the driver's seat, started the car, and started driving down the side roads. I just sat there helplessly, silently staring at the streetlights as we passed them, thinking about what I could say to plead for my life. My hands were seriously shaking and my mind was racing as it occurred to me that this man, he wasn't wearing a mask, which meant that he didn't care if I saw his face. To me, this meant that he didn't plan to leave anyone to identify him, so I was definitely going to die. As we drove in silence, the carjacker seemed to become more and more agitated, glancing around nervously, muttering things to himself and staring at the clock in the road randomly back and forth. It felt like several hours were passing, though it was honestly only a few minutes. I actually started thinking about whether anyone would notice that I wasn't back after a while. I assumed that my manager would notice after a while since I had cash that belonged to the store and had texted him, but that was about it. A lot of strange things go through your mind when you're in this kind of situation, because really the only thing that I could think about was how I was going to get fired if I got killed. Again, not logical, but it was all I could think about. After another few moments, the carjacker pulled over to the side of the road and started breathing really fast. I didn't look at him. I didn't turn my head. I just shut my eyes, thinking, well, this is where he cracks. After a few moments, he screams, "This wasn't what I effing planned!" and then punches the steering wheel. I jumped, and I couldn't help but look in his direction, and he was seriously crying. Like, sobbing. His eyes were filled with a strange mix of anger, desperation, and regret. And he turned to me and just said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we had to meet under these circumstances." His voice cracked as he said this, and he just shook his head like he was seriously upset. A couple more seconds pass of this awkward silence, and then he turns, reaches behind me, grabs the pizza bag, and exits the car, walking off into the woods on the side of the road. For a moment, I was too stunned to move. But as the feeling in my arms and feet slowly started to come back, I realized that the danger had passed. I hopped over to the driver's seat and sped away, eager to get the hell away from that man and this place. The entire time I was driving, my lip was quivering, my teeth were chattering, and I was shaking, thinking that it wasn't actually over. That someone else or something was going to jump out at me and attack me. Obviously nothing did, and I was able to make it back to the store. I got into the safety of the building and I broke down. I was bawling my eyes out, trying to explain that I was carjacked by this man, trying to explain everything that I had just gone through. Thankfully, my coworkers were able to get me settled down, but then after a few moments, my manager asked me why I hadn't called him or called the police. Honestly, at no point did it occur to me while I was driving away from the situation to grab my phone and call anyone. Stupid, I know, but panic makes it hard to think clearly. They did call the police, and they took my statement, but I couldn't tell them the exact location that he had gotten out of my car, only where he had actually carjacked me. I doubt that he was ever caught, because all I could tell them was what he was wearing and a vague direction of where he could have gone. I'm thankful that he didn't decide that I was a threat to him, or that he needed to do worse than he had, and I honestly think about that night a lot. The fact that I got out unharmed, that he apologized and then stole the pizza. What kind of situation does one have to be in to do that? I don't work there anymore, as mentioned, and I don't do anything related to driving my car or working with the public. I work in a warehouse now, and I love it. Because there's literally no opportunity for anything like this to ever happen again while I'm at work.
Yesterday, I took my son fishing. He wanted to go to a nearby lake that we haven't been to in quite some time, and it's not known to be a great area. For some background, the last time we went, about a year ago, a car drove by and screamed, "Nice ass!" at me while I stood there with my young son. This kind of garbage behavior is unfortunately expected in that area. It's also known to be a late-night hookup spot, as well as a late-night drug deal location. And due to the lake's reputation, I had made a deal with my dad that I wouldn't stay there past 4 p.m. without him. Now, on to the story. My 12-year-old son, who looks much younger than he is, we both pulled up at our favorite fishing spot, a small pond on the opposite side of the road as the lake, and almost immediately, an older gentleman approached us, asking if there were fish in the pond. I replied that we had just gotten started, so nothing yet, but that we had caught fish in the pond on plenty of other occasions. He thanked us for the information and returned to his spot on the other side of the road. About 15 minutes later, another younger man approaches the older man with a dog. I can see and hear them chatting, but they've made no move to involve us in the conversation, which I'm actually glad for. I just want to enjoy a day with my son. Well, unfortunately, the water in the pond was incredibly low and murky, and I could tell that we weren't going to have any luck. So I tell my son to pack it up and we'll try another spot on the other side of the lake. As we begin packing our gear into the trunk, the younger man yells over, "Sorry if my dog and I ran you off." I tell him it's no problem and that we were simply moving to a better fishing spot. He then starts telling me how nice it is to see a mom taking her kid fishing and how you don't see that very often and etc. I get this a lot, so I'm pretty used to it. We have a short conversation about it as I pack up, and I then move towards the driver's side doors to depart. But before I can leave, the younger man starts up another conversation, this time asking me how old I think he is. This feels strange to me, but I'm nice to a fault sometimes, so I answer his question. I tell him that I'm a horrible judge of age, but maybe 25? He tells me that he is 38, and that I'm too kind, and I laugh it off by saying something like, "I work with teenagers, so they always guess me well above my age just to be mean." He asks where I work, and I stupidly tell him my city. Turns out he lives there too, and starts going on and on about how he got a free apartment on such and such street because his baby mama kicked him out of their house. I think he's talking about some kind of government assistance program. It's a weird flex, but okay, man. At this point, I'm standing by the car door with my hand on the handle, and my son is already in the back seat. This guy can't take the hint and starts telling me all about his awful baby mama and how women are supposed to be submissive, quiet, and do what they're told to. He specifically said, "I mean, it's cool that you can bait and hook or whatever, but you're still a woman." Now, my alarm bells are blaring. This guy struck up a conversation by commending me for doing a typically dad thing with my kid, but now he's putting me down for the same thing. He's gone from being overly friendly and complimentary to agitated and ranting. I should have been rude and just got in my car and left, but I've unfortunately been conditioned, like many women, to be polite even when we're uncomfortable. Instead, I start making comments in the hopes that he'll see that I'm not some meek, submissive woman who's going to agree with him. After all, I'm a tatted up chick with an eyebrow piercing and 2 lip piercings. I don't exactly look like a submissive little housewife. I guess I was trying to make him just as uncomfortable as he made me, in the hopes that he would leave me alone. After he says women shouldn't be loud or opinionated, I tell him, "Oh, well, you wouldn't like me at all." He tries to backpedal, saying, "I mean, it's okay to be loud, I guess, but don't try that with your man, you know." I say, "My man doesn't tell me shit. I do what I want." This kind of goes back and forth, and it just goes on for a while, before he finally shakes his head and says, "I just don't understand what kind of woman would act like that." And I just reply, "A strong one." And as soon as the words left my mouth, the older gentleman yells from his spot on the bank, "Yeah, say that again, honey." This distracted the creep long enough for me to hop in the car and then lock the doors. I still don't feel safe though. Unbeknownst to Creepazoid, only 2 of my car doors actually have functioning locks, but at least they're the 2 on his side. I put the key in the ignition, no dice, nothing. Of all the times for my car to act up, it chooses now. Panic has now set in, As I repeatedly try to start my car, I can see him out the corner of my eye and he's taken notice of my car troubles and is trying to get my attention. As he takes a few steps towards my car, the engine finally roars to life and I peel out of there. Only then do I let my composure crumble and have a long talk with my son about what just happened. To the older gentleman who took notice of my discomfort and provided a distraction, I'd gladly meet with you again any day. But to the younger misogynistic creep, I don't know if I was actually in any danger from you, but my gut said that I was. Let's never meet again. Oh, and to my dad, I'll make you a new deal. I am never going to that lake alone again, regardless of the time of day. I'm a male, and years back when I was 20, I was walking back to my car from the library in the city. I was on a side street, and it was about 10 p.m. I had my backpack on and it was full, and it had my laptop in it. So, I am on a pretty dark street, and there are lights, but they are very far apart, so it gets very dark in between them. I come across this man walking his big pit bull, and he came off as really nice at first. He smiled and he wanted to chat. So I stopped, and we are talking normal, and I was asking about his dog. But after 30 seconds or so, he sort of steers us into a dark spot under a tree without the streetlight, and I thought that it was strange, but okay, because maybe it was for his dog. But then he moves. So he and his dog are both in front of me, and I am cornered into the house behind me. And I start getting this bad feeling. This whole time, he is being friendly and smiling, but at certain points, he would get serious, almost like he was thinking of his next move. And he was moving closer, all the while fidgeting with his other hand in his pocket. Now, he is very close to me at this point, and I had nowhere to go because my back is against the angled window, so I'm literally in the corner blocked on all sides by him and his dog, and this house behind me. My internal siren is blaring at this point. I'm a very nervous person, but I am shaking at this point and I feel that I am cornered and it's pitch black under the shade. I decided to spring out from being cornered against the house and then into the street. He looked surprised, almost like, "Where'd you go?" And he begins walking towards me, and as I get to the middle of the street, I took my backpack off of one shoulder and I grabbed my apple carving knife, and he stopped walking towards me. I get to a more busy area with people and I hop in a cab, and the cab driver notices that I am shaking. I told him that I was just about to get robbed, and I asked him to tell the police. And once I got to my car, I drove near where I was, and I saw 3 cop SUVs with their sirens on going towards that area. Later on, I heard that there were a bunch of robberies that happened in this part of the city. This happened around the summer of 2000 in Midwest USA, and I was a 12-year-old boy. I was shy and I never did well with confrontation. Anytime I was scared, I'd feel myself shaking. One day, my dad and cousin were weightlifting in the garage and it was open. I then decided to grab my bicycle out of the garage and then ride up and down the street while my dad and cousin lifted. As I am pedaling away from my house, I see another kid riding his bike, probably 5 to 6 houses down from mine, but he's just kinda going in circles. I maybe get like 20 feet near him, but that's it. No words were exchanged, Not even a wave or a nod, and I just kept my head down and I kept pedaling. On my next circle back down the street, that's when things got weird. I got near the area where the kid had been riding, and he's not around anymore, so I guessed that he went inside wherever he lived. And right as I'm about to turn around and head towards my house, which is like probably 80 to 100 yards away, I hear a man yell, "Hey!" in an unsettling tone. I look up, and a man is standing in his front doorway, probably 25 feet from me, as I'm paused on the street with my bike. He's one of the creepiest looking dudes that I have ever seen in my life. He has on a ball cap, and he's wearing this thick Jeffrey Dahmer looking glasses, tan burnt orange, dirty looking wrinkled skin, and he had to be around in his 40s probably. He looked straight out of a horror movie, and he just had this sinister angry look on his face. He then says, "If you say anything to my son again, I'm going to run your ass over." At this point, I was crying and frozen with fear, but then I start biking home faster than ever. I'd never been in a situation like this in my life. I couldn't believe what happened because I never said anything to that boy. So I get to the open garage where my dad and cousin are still lifting. I tell them the story, and they decide to go to this guy's house and address the situation that just occurred. My dad and cousin had a few beers and are pretty jacked, so they were ready to tussle if needed. My dad goes straight to this guy's door with my cousin behind him and then knocks loudly. The man opens the door and has this huge Rottweiler by his side, barking and going crazy at my dad and cousin. He threatens to let the dog loose, but my dad and cousin aren't cowering down one bit. After a bit of bickering for a minute, the guy goes inside his house and then shuts the door. Nothing else happens that night, and we walk back home. A few days pass, and now I'm about to get to the creepiest part. During the summer, when my parents worked during the day, my grandma would come over and babysit my little brother and I. We were about 10 minutes from downtown, and my grandma was going to take us there to grab food at Sonic. We get in her car and start driving down the road towards that creepy dude's house. This made me feel very uneasy, but that's the direction we had to go. And as we get closer to the house, the hair on my neck starts to stand up again. As we go by the house, I see him. He's sitting in a red truck in his driveway, facing the road like he's about to pull out. I don't remember well, but I think he might have had a grin on his face as we drove by. We pass the house and he pulls out behind us. I start freaking out a bit, so I tell my grandma the story about the man driving behind us. At first, my grandma was chill about it, but then I noticed that she seemed a bit shaken. This is because she had made about 67 turns to throw him off our trail, but he still kept following us. Every little turn. And at this point, me and my brother are in the back seat with our heads down as he follows us. But luckily, we made it to downtown where it was busy. We get near the police station, I believe, and take another turn. Then finally, he just passes on by. I never saw that man again. My mom and dad split up and we left that neighborhood 2 years later with my mom to move to the country. My dad still lives at the same house, and I wonder if that dude stuck around for a while or even still lives at that house. What was his intent? Was it a coincidence, or did he really plan on following us? It was so weird how it looked like he was just waiting in his driveway for us to pass by. I have hesitated to share this story for a long time, because I know how important the mutual trust between a resident and their landlord or maintenance staff is, and I don't want to instill any unnecessary distrust in anyone's landlord. I've shared stories before about dangerous and scary residents that I encountered while working at apartment complexes. But this is a story about my time on the other side of things as a renter. Before I had even graduated from high school, I knew that I wanted to live at Paradise Apartments. I was a bit naive at that time, drawn in by the many amenities that I would never use. But I primarily wanted to live there because the complex was pet-friendly and within my small budget. When the time eventually came for me to get my own place, I sublet the only apartment that they had available, and then I moved in. Unfortunately, I came to realize that the apartment wasn't as nice as I'd originally thought. The building was old but remodeled, so it had all the typical plumbing issues and thin walls. I also learned that it was not the safest part of town. I was primarily an online student, but I had one class that met in person twice a week at around 8 a.m. I'm a bit of a homebody, so I rarely left during the day except for that class, the occasional shopping excursion, or to spend time with my boyfriend in the evening after he got off of work. My apartment was a bit of a Bermuda Triangle, even though it was only 600 square feet and I live alone. Things had a way of growing legs and walking away. I had 2 kittens at that time, and I blamed them regularly for things disappearing. Something odd that kept reoccurring, however, was that I would find my underwear box out and sitting in the center of my bedroom floor on days when I had a class. I didn't have a proper dresser. Instead, I'm using an IKEA shelf with some IKEA boxes for designated clothes, maybe socks, underwear, pants, and pajamas. But I always could have sworn that I'd put the underwear box away after getting ready for class. But I chalked it up to me forgetting as a result of having to get up early and being focused on getting to class on time. Arguably paranoid, I started to think that some of my laundry was disappearing as well, as my favorite articles of clothing would go into the laundry hamper and seemingly never come back with the clean clothes. Towards the end of that semester, I was working one evening on a homework assignment when my boyfriend called to let me know that his roommate had accidentally locked him out of the apartment. I had a key to their place, so he asked if I could run over real quick to let him in. And before I left, I had made a mental note that I had left literally every light in my apartment on. Because I was living on a pretty tight budget, I normally made a point of turning off all the lights when I left. But my boyfriend only lived about 5 minutes away, so I knew that I'd be there and back very quickly. Sure enough, I got back less than 15 minutes later. But I immediately sensed something was off, as I could see that the lights were off through the blinds. I called my boyfriend and he drove over to meet me. We unlocked the door and then we went in. All the lights were off in my apartment. Thinking maybe I'd have a power outage, I flipped on the main light and it came on. My boyfriend checked the entire apartment and no one was inside, but someone had gone through and systematically turned off every light at their switch, including my lizard's basking light, the only light that I always left on because it was on a timer. And my laptop, which I'd left open on my assignment, but now the computer had been powered down and closed. We called the emergency maintenance number and I explained that someone had been inside my apartment and that they have used the key because there was no sign of forced entry. My manager called me back and told me that I had to be imagining things. Maybe I had forgotten that I had turned off all the lights before I left, and I assured him that I wouldn't have turned off the computer or the lizard light. Someone had been in my apartment. I told him that I was extremely worried because obviously this person had a key to get in. Either they worked for the complex or maybe it was a previous tenant or guest. I asked if they had changed the locks after the previous tenant moved out, and they assured me that they changed the locks after they moved out. The manager suggested that maybe it was a friend pranking me, someone else that I probably had given a key. But the only other people that I had given keys were my boyfriend and my mom, and she lives 3 hours away. In any case, neither of them would have pranked me in this way. The manager finally agreed to send someone out immediately to change the lock for my peace of mind. I brought up my concern that it was someone on the staff since they would be the only other people with keys. The manager claimed that the keys were locked in a special safe that required a personalized code in an office with a security camera. They changed my locks, but I had my doubts that it would do much good. As far as I was aware, there were only 2 maintenance men that worked at that complex. One nice older man that didn't seem all that skilled, and a younger guy with a scruffy beard that gave me a bad feeling, and I suspected that he had to be the one that had come in. When I had first moved, the manager had told me that I would be getting a new kitchen counter within the first 3 days. I waited to move in my kitchen stuff, but after a week they hadn't come, and then after a few months, that I had completely forgotten about it. One day I was sitting in my living room, and this scruffy maintenance guy walked in without knocking or announcing himself, and I hadn't received a notice to expect him. He said he was there to replace my countertop, and it took him 2 days to install one small piece of counter. A few weeks later, I was getting out of the shower, and I heard a single knock at the door. I called out, "Just 1 minute!" And I hurried to get some clothes. But not 2 seconds later, the door started to open and I had to slam it shut, just to stop him from coming in. He claimed that he hadn't heard me called out, but I had my doubts. And I don't remember what made-up excuse he had for coming in. Another time, I found a note from him that he had come in, again, and it didn't even give a reason as to why, but that he made sure not to let my cats out. He also made a note about my 3rd cat being cute. Except, I didn't have a 3rd cat. I did, however, have a picture of my childhood cat in my bedroom on the IKEA shelf where I keep my clothes. At that point, I went to the office to ask them to make a note in my file that I wanted at least 24 hours notice before entry going forward. And also, I wanted to always be present for future entry. Now that I knew without a shadow of a doubt that someone was coming in secretly, it all made sense. It hadn't been long after the surprise maintenance visit stopped that things had started moving around in my apartment. He was also on site all of the time, so he would know when I came and I went. Who knew how many times he had snuck in, how many small souvenirs he had stolen? He could have been coming in while I was asleep. After the night with the lights, I put my own lock on the door, but still didn't totally trust the apartment. I ended up buying a condo shortly after, with the help of my parents. I subleased the apartment and then I moved. In the final days before I left, my mom came into town to help me move my stuff, and while she was home alone and I was at class, she caught the scruffy maintenance man trying to get his key to work in my lock. She demanded to know what he was doing, and he said that he was here to paint the front door. I hadn't received a notice, and he didn't have any paint or supplies, and she told him that he could wait until after I moved out. A few years later, I was shocked by the owner of the apartments while working at another complex in town, OK Apartments. Shopping is when an employee from one apartment complex takes a tour at another apartment complex under the guise of wanting an apartment for the purpose of gaining information that they might not otherwise easily give up. It can also be performed by your own management company to make sure that you're doing a good job. There were certain tells a shopper always gave, like asking specifically worded questions. Is it safe here? I'm a felon, can I live here? And etc. Those kinds of examples. And that required specifically worded answers and were easy to trip up on, being too wealthy for the complex. Rolex watch, sports car, nice suit, and etc. And being too flexible on what they were interested. And for example, they were interested in all the layouts and were open to move in whenever. This guy seemed too old and too well off to be randomly considering an apartment at OK. We were geared toward lower income folks. And while I was giving the tour, he asked if I had any opinions on other apartment complexes in town and mentioned Paradise specifically. And normally, I wouldn't badmouth any other complexes. I preferred to win them over by showing them the positives of our community. But I told him that I probably wasn't the best person to ask that question because I was probably the only person to give Paradise a bad review in the last 5 years. He asked me to elaborate, and I told him my apartment had been broken into, and I suspected that it was someone on their maintenance staff. At that point, he revealed that he was the owner of Paradise, and that he was very disturbed to hear that I had this experience. He asked me to describe the maintenance man in detail. I assured him that it was in the past and that I was over it, but he insisted on calling the manager over at Paradise. It was still the same guy, and he asked him over speakerphone if they had had any issues with the maintenance staff back in the year that I have lived there. He answered yes, that there had been a scruffy young maintenance man that he had to fire because he had been caught multiple times breaking into the apartments of single women. Satisfied, the owner proudly told me that the issue had been resolved and asked if I would be willing to change my review. I told him no. None of this had changed the fact that I had experienced this and actually validated what I had suspected. In the years that I worked as a leasing agent, I learned a lot about where complexes will cut corners to save time and money. From my experience, a lot did not switch out the locks if the tenant was good, and a lot did not require background checks for employees, even though they did require them from tenants. Keys also got passed out willy-nilly to vendors and maintenance during turns, and the employees frequently got master keys that would open all of the doors. I won't go so far as to say every complex operated this way, but every complex that I worked at was doing this when I started there. Because of my own experiences, once I began managing a complex, I enforced strict rules about changing locks, tracking keys, posting proper notices, and requiring background checks for all employees and also tenants. At least here in Florida, with MIA's law going into effect this year, background checks for employees and security measures for keys are required for all the complexes. Even still, if you're renting an apartment, stay diligent. If you have a reason to believe that someone is coming into your house, document it and let the staff, police, family, and friends know about it. You never know who might have a key to your apartment. This occurred in 2017 in NSW, Australia. When I was younger, I had a sleepover with 7 of my friends, 2 of which arrived later on in the night. It was around 9:30 at night when we were all surrounding the campfire that my friend's stepdad had built the day earlier for the party. My friend and I both got up to walk to a small tin shed in the backyard that was full of mattresses and used primarily for storage. And as we were walking towards the said shed, I stopped mid-walk because I thought I saw someone standing right in between the two fences opposite of his house. I got really scared about this, and I went straight back to the campfire without telling an adult for some strange reason. But when I woke up the next day, we all went out to check if the coals were still hot because his dogs liked to jump in the fire pit. When everyone went to check the coals, I went towards the fence where I thought I saw this person, and to my surprise, actually found 2 size 12 shoe impressions in the ground, which flattened the extremely long grass. 2 months later, my friend group was wandering the streets in my small rural suburb at night. On the main road that went through the estate, there was a really sketchy park with an old block of toilets and a set of swings. When someone suggested that we walk over to the park to hang out on the way to someone's house, I pointed out that there was what appeared to be a dude with a kid on the swings. When someone suggested that we walk over to the park to hang out on the way to someone's house, I pointed out that there was what appeared to be a dude with a kid on the swings. But as we switched the side of the road we were walking on, I realized that there was only one person, a guy dressed in black pushing an empty swing. I also spotted that the guy's head and the right hand was twitching constantly and very aggressively. And after some convincing, we all got pretty freaked out by it and then decided to walk, run to my friend's house. 5 months after that, I woke up in my room to go to the toilet in the ensuite, which also had a bathroom, a large sink, and a shower. And as I sat down on the toilet, I could hear something tapping on the toilet window. It was like a tree branch, and for some strange reason, the light turned off. I hid behind the beam in the ensuite and slowly peeked out the window, to which I could see someone directly standing in between the corridor outside in the fernery. Coming out of the toilet, instead of walking down to the hallway and telling my parents, I turned right to the laundry door, which led to the washing machine, the dryer, and another door opposite that. And in a spat of courage, I flung the door wide open and I screamed, "Boo!" really loudly. But to my surprise, I couldn't see anyone. I actually couldn't see anyone, and as I said boo, I realized that I could feel my breath almost coming back, like there was a wall in front of me. And looking up, I realized that there was a person standing right in front of the fly screen, blocking out my view, which was limited to above the person's shoulders and under his hands. I assumed that it was a guy because their body shape is eerily similar to mine, with broad shoulders and roughly 6'7" to 6'8" tall. Because I am 6'8", and I have to suck in most of the door frames. The next morning, I went out with my mom to the garage to find the sand on the ground with this hiking boot-like impressions leading toward the 2 gates, which were flung wide open and one even off the hinges. I passed all of this off with simple explanations as a kid. The guy in the fence was a neighbor who was curious about the party. The person at the park was just a weirdo who was trying to scare kids during that killer clown phase. And the last one, I honestly have no idea, as do none of my friends or family members that I have told this to. But what is very creepy to me is that all of these 3 individuals I saw all had the exact same body shape and posture. You know, kinda slumped over because of their height and sitting position. Which leads me to believe that these were all the same person. And later confirmed with my friends that they all saw the one dude by himself on multiple occasions acting really weird around dusk on school days, near the bus stops. Me, my mother, and my sisters will occasionally gather around in the kitchen or the living room or wherever and talk about the scary encounters or stories. My mom's side of the family is very superstitious. They believe in ghosts, angels, demons, spirits, and what have you. And there are a lot of true stories that my mom and grandmother can put into a book. But there's always this one story that's very unfortunate that I have heard a few times. My mom tells it in a mix of Filipino and English usually, so I'll try my best to translate. My mom was raised in a large town in one of the central Philippine islands in a relatively large family. All her relatives lived close by, and this one particular cousin, let's call him Ronaldo, lived right next to her. My mom was so convinced that her other cousin, his sister, let's call her Bats, was a prostitute in her 20s. Well, anyways, Ronaldo was 17 at that time and was a handsome and loved kid. One day he was playing basketball with his friends and happened to suffer a leg injury. It was so deeply affected that gangrene had begun to emerge. Medical assistance in the Philippines, of course, being a third world country, at that time was quite an expense. So he kept it under the wraps no matter how much worse it was getting, and that he even had it for such a long time. His mom finally saw how terrible it was getting, and Bats had come home from her prostitution ventures and was able to take him and pay for his medical bills, in which the doctors and specialists eventually said that they had to cut his leg off. But the bacteria had already spread up to his hip, so at that time that he was recuperating, he was using crutches. To further understand, before there was ever any modern construction done around where my mom lived and Ronaldo and Bat's house, there was a gap/entrance/alley between their houses where one could go through to get to her cousin's house. It was cemented and concrete. You know the sound crutches make on concrete when it's being walked on? Kind of like a tuck, 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 tuck sound. Ronaldo had died a few months later from the worsening injury that eventually took over his whole body. So late at night, you could occasionally hear outside exactly where the concrete gap was. Tuck, 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 continuously. Exactly in the pattern that Ronaldo usually walked, which was distinguishable. This was all during my mom's childhood, and nowadays you can't hear it anymore. I guess according to them, his soul has been laid to rest now. It is decades later, and everyone has either moved away or passed, and my mom had already moved to the US to start a new life. So Bats decided to rent out the house, and the people who had moved into the house claimed that they could always hear some type of crying that sounded like a baby's right inside the house, even though they had no baby and there wasn't anyone around. Years later, my mom's relatives found out that Bat's sister had previously had her baby aborted and buried just somewhere around the house. I've always yearned to help others, to save the needy from suffering, You see, the world doesn't need imagined monsters. Plenty of real ones haunt humanity every day. Disease, poverty, oppression, all scarier than the demons in horror stories. Or so I thought. 7 years ago, the charity I work for sent me to the Philippines to help a few villages prepare evacuation plans in case of flooding. The poverty was bad enough. The first village lay next to a dirty trash-soaked river. The nipa houses rested on stilts that stood upon caked mud amid a sprawling jungle. 2 opposing tree stumps with perched buckets is how I would describe the basketball court. But despite this, the villagers exuded joy. During the afternoon siesta, men would gather on plastic tables and pass around coconut wine while playing cards or mahjong. And in the evening, they would congregate in the village captain's house and sing 90s classics on the karaoke machine, and sometimes even until the roosters crowed. They got the nipa wood for the houses from the mangroves that lined the river's edge like a wall of roots. And as strong as the material was, a fierce flood could annihilate an entire nipa village in an hour. A successful evacuation requires an easy path to high ground, and so, from the comfort of my hotel suite in Cebu, I drew a route through the jungle and up the nearby mountain, which loomed over the village like a titan. Aside from that, I spent my time at the hotel phoning corporal social responsibility heads, usually while drinking whiskey in the bathtub, and after much cajoling, raised funds for rowboats, life vests and canned food, and loudspeakers and other essential for surviving a flood. It was all going smoothly. Well, until I drove back to the village and then presented my plan. The village captain, whom everyone called grandmother because she was the eldest, had prepared a feast for me, which she cooked in literal holes in the grass. "No one here is old enough," she said while we were having lunch under billowing black clouds. "But I remember what happened in that mountain." I loved eating on a banana leaf, but cupping the rice and meat with my hands still seemed a bit awkward. I answered her, "Good things, I hope." And she hesitated, chewing her food slowly, then shook her head and said, "Aswang lived there." I didn't speak Tagalog nor the local language of that region, so I simply stared back, my eyebrows raised, and said, "I'm sorry, what's an aswang?" The village captain told me a story. When she was a young girl, the village was located on the other side of the mountain away from the river. And it was well off, because the men worked at the mountain's tin mine and the price of tin was high. But strange things began happening. A few men who went to work in the mine didn't come out quite the same. Some of the wives, specifically the pregnant ones, would claim that creatures called aswang had taken their husbands' forms. They would wake up in the night and see their husbands staring intently at their swollen bellies, slobber dripping from their mouths. I laughed in the village captain's face, thinking it was a joke. How rude and foolish I was. But I had 4 other villages to deal with during that trip. "I'm afraid there's no time to change the evacuation plan. Typhoon season is here after all." The village captain persisted. "Because of those aswang, no baby was born in the village for a whole year. The mothers always disappeared before they would give birth. And only when the tin mine went bust and we relocated to this river did things return to normal." "I understand your fears." I didn't. "But it's the only high ground for miles. It even has caves for shelter, and it's an easy climb. There's simply no better place to save everyone's lives." The other villagers I talked to didn't share her concern, which reassured me, because if they believed such a ridiculous tale, I'd be forced to find another site. I stayed overnight intending to practice my evacuation plan with everyone in the morning before I moved on to the next village, which was on a different island. But we never got to practice. At sunrise, the sky bellowed and opened, wind screamed and howled as if some mighty god were blowing upon the world and flinging coconut and papaya trees like twigs. The bulging river overflowed past the mangroves, and the stilts supporting the nipa huts weren't sturdy enough to keep the water from sucking them up. The world knows this catastrophe as Typhoon Haiyan, but they call it Typhoon Yolanda there. Over 6,000 people died and another 1,700 went missing. One of them because of me. Though I earnestly wanted to help when the flood waters surged with the wind scourge, I wished I were back in my comfy hotel suite. Still, I did my job, and as soon as the storm began, I gathered the villagers at the basketball court. Then we marched along a dirt path through the jungle and toward the mountain. I ensured the children, the elderly, and the pregnant women among us walked in front so that they wouldn't lag behind. Because I'd scouted it a few days ago, I knew that the trek up to the mountain would be straightforward. A winding path brought us high enough where we could wait out the storm. Watching the villagers huddle together amid the caverns, stare cheerful despite the calamity, I finally felt that I've done some good. And as I passed around blankets and canned food and life vest, I realized how much more fulfilling this was than phoning corporate heads while drinking whiskey in a tub. It all started to go wrong when a young man came up to the village captain and me. I'll never forget his pockmarked and narrow face and the way he waved his arms in panic as if he was trying to block a basketball shot. The village captain translated his pleading. His wife went to relieve herself, and now she's missing. I pounced at another chance to help, to fulfill my heart's yearning, so I organized a search party amid apocalyptic rain and screeching wind. I and several other able men and women scouted the mountain. We failed to find her together. We divided into groups of 2, and when that didn't work, we split up individually, each taking a life vest, flashlight, and blowhorn to alert each other in case of danger. I decided to descend and search around the mountain's base, and after 30 minutes trudging against the gale and through the mud, I discovered a wide cave, within which was utter darkness. As I stared at the mouth, I heard a woman's whimper, followed by what I can only describe as a deep, throaty cough that lasted a few seconds too long. Or was it simply the wind scathing the cave walls? "Hello?" I shouted. I considered using the blowhorn, but decided to confirm what it was before alerting others. I grabbed my flashlight and I continued inside. A damp, fleshy smell shot into my nose. I called the woman's name, and pained whimpers sounded back. I hurried forwarding and stepped on something sharp that almost split my shoe. I pointed my flashlight at it. A broken car track, and I had entered a mine. Around me, I saw wheelbarrows of ore covered in pounds of dust. A tin mine. Immediately, I recalled the story of the aswang that impersonated the miners. A tightness gripped my chest. I didn't believe in imagined monsters. But who knows what could have been waiting in the darkness ahead. I wanted to turn and run, but I pushed on, reminding myself why I was there. To save people. The whimpering was just ahead, and I wish I could snap my fingers and teleport back to the hotel, where I could hide underneath the silky duvet on the Super King bed. How cozy it would be to wait out the storm there. My heartbeat surged as I squeezed my flashlight to settle the trembles, and I stepped onward and shined my light forward. A pregnant woman lay writhing on the floor, and above her stood the same pockmarked faced man who'd been waving his arms earlier. He hunched over her, his mouth widened, and slobber dripped from it. "Hello?" I said. "Glad you found her. Is she all right?" He ignored me. His mouth stretched beyond what was humanly possible while emitting a throaty wail, and then a hand slithered out of his mouth. The arm the hand was attached to had 3 elbows, and they bent at odd angles as it stretched towards his wife's right belly. I pulled out my blowhorn and pressed. It blared like a trumpet of Judgment Day, echoing against the cave walls. The thing snapped its head toward me. The hand coming out of its mouth contorted with bony snaps until all 3 elbows straightened. It grabbed at my face, just missing as I backed away and turned. I'd said I always wanted to help people, but in that moment, as my heart quavered and panic engulfed every sense, I only wanted to help myself. I ran, and I ran until I was out of the cave and breathless, back amid the deluge. And instead of climbing up the mountain, I sprinted through the jungle toward the village, which was nearly submerged and drifting with the tide. Water reached my waist, but still, I trudged through, my life vest keeping me from drowning. And then the current swept me, and it carried me through a thicket of downed trees, washed away nipa huts and plastic. And though terrifying, this was heaven compared to facing the creature in that cave. Half an hour later, some brave volunteers in a paddle boat rescued me, and I told them that I was running from an aswang, but they laughed, thinking I'm some kind of crazy foreigner. I spent a few days in a shelter, then I returned to Cebu. I resigned from the charity, and once the storm had passed, I took the first flight home. A while later, I heard from a colleague that the villagers survived, save for one pregnant woman who'd gone missing. I've had 7 years to think about it since then, but my conclusion never changes. By ignoring the village captain's warning and guiding them to that cursed mountain, I caused something unmentionable to happen to that woman and her unborn child. I've done exactly the opposite of what I yearned to do. I'd hurt instead of helped because of my arrogance. The guilt still eats me, and I don't dare try to help anyone anymore. I'm a corporate drone now, slaving every day to make someone else rich. Better than hurting others with my good intentions. I was born and raised in the Philippines, enjoying my time spent with the family, baking in the sun all day, running through the fields of sugarcane, and biking through small mountainous terrain without any care in the world. But at night, things were odd. Filipinos at large are raised with mythical and mysterious stories, handed down from generation to generation, that everyone predominantly believes. So, for a 10-year-old boy, the anxiety and fear kicks in when the sun isn't shining. I lived in a mansion located in a barrio that my uncle owned, in which he also owns fields upon fields of sugarcane that was processed to sugar and exported out to several countries. We had approximately 6 maids, 1 driver, and a security guard at night to ensure nothing were to be stolen or any intruders were to come in. Sometimes at night, to make myself feel better, I would join the security guard Lauro and be a badass, taking watch, looking after the mansion and the family. Lauro asked, "So, what do you want to talk about tonight?" I heard several of the barrio kids talking about this thing called manananggal, I answered. "Oh, yes. Those are really scary flying demons. Wings are attached to their torso, and they're missing its lower half of the body. They hunt at night for children because this is what they prey upon. As a matter of fact, I saw a huge bat that I could have sworn was a manananggal, Laro said. The hairs on the back of my neck start to rise, and I start to feel anxious and scared. I ask him, "What do you mean you saw one? That was probably a bat. Those things aren't real." "Maybe you're right. But listen, it's getting really late. Your uncle would get mad at me if you're out too late. So go inside and go to sleep." And I said with a panic, "Oh, I lost track of time. You're right. I'll run inside and go to bed." It was approximately 35 walking paces, 21 if I ran, which I did because at this point, I was scared as shit, hoping that damn manananggal wasn't real. My heart was racing, blood pumping, and I was lightning fast. I rushed up the stairs and I got in my room and I went to bed under the sheets. It seemed like it took me forever to just pass out, which I eventually did. But later on I could feel a little sweat from my neck that was now in my uncomfortable bed. I was rolling around it and I had fully woken up. I don't remember what time it was, but it was loud. One of the elder maids, Miss Garrett, was yelling weird things. "Get out of here. You are not welcome. Leave us alone. Get out of here. Stop pestering us. You are not welcome." This went on for what seems like hours and hours, and at this point, my light was turned on. I was staring at my ceiling, wondering why she was yelling. If there was an intruder, Laura would have been in there and taken care of the business. Miss Garrett, after all, is old and maybe even senile. My aunt told me that she supposedly spoke randomly when she felt a presence of some sort. But I mean, she's old. All of a sudden, Miss Garrett was quiet. I can finally sleep in peace, but then my lights flickered and then turned off. I was about to shit my pants. I know no one is in my room, so why did the power go off? Was it a blackout? The hair on the back of my neck started to rise again, and I'm scared shitless. I feel a tugging on my pillow, as if someone's hand was trying to feel for something or find something. Then it gripped my pillow. My pillow and blanket was yanked out from under me, and immediately the lights went back on. My pillow and blanket were on the floor, and Miss Garrett knocked and opened my door and asked me if I was okay. I gave her a very shocked look, but nodded to her to let her know that I was okay. "Now you know why I sometimes talk out loud, even when you don't see anyone that I am talking to. They are there. I try to keep the evil spirits away from you and your family," Miss Garrett said. My life changed that night, 21 years ago. I don't believe in those folkloric mythical creatures like the manananggal, but I can confirm with experience that there are evil spirits. 3 years after that incident, I moved to Florida, and nothing like that has ever happened. Well, until just last night. Miss Garrett, I need you. Please, help me. About 4 years ago, I took a vacation to the Philippines. Now let me say that it is truly a beautiful place, and I'd almost 100% take another vacation to the Philippines. But I can't shake that I'd be in the domain of the mountain. You know, Mount Pinatubo? The one that erupted in 1991 and killed 740 people. Well, anyways, 4 years ago, I decided to take a vacation to the Philippines due to the stress at my job. I had enough vacation days to go somewhere and still use them as sick days if I run out of sick days. and when I got off the plane and had gotten to my hotel, I then checked in and then went to my room. My room looked like your stereotypical family vacation. 2 beds with white sheets, pillows and blankets, and a brown comforter at the bottom of the bed. There was also a television that only had kid channels that were mostly in Filipino. There was also a mini fridge, which was really the 3/4 of a fridge. And I was glad that the hotel I was staying at served food. It was a long flight from New England to the Philippines, so I decided to sleep and also decided that whatever time I woke up was the time that I would get my stuff and pack and then go find something to do. When I did wake up, it was around 5:34 a.m., so I got my things and packed after waking myself up with some water, and I then went out to find something to do. I decided to head to what looked like a cafe for some coffee. It turns out that splashing water on your face will only temporarily prevent fatigue. In the cafe, I ordered some coffee and then waited for the waiter to come back with my coffee. While I was waiting, a group of Filipino college students came up to me and asked me a question, and thank God they spoke fluent English. And I know it sounds a bit wrong, but it was really nice to have someone who was not a television screen speak fluent English to me. "Hey there, we're going hiking for a fundraiser for our school. Do you want to come?" asked the female student. It took me a minute to respond because of how open and cheery the student was. I almost wanted to praise her for being so open. "Sure, I'm just waiting on some coffee. Care to join?" I said in return. She looked at me with a grin and took a seat next to my table. The rest of the group sat down with me and we talked as we waited for my coffee. "So, what are you raising money for?" I asked. "Oh well, our school is in a pretty poor condition and we want to help the administration as much as possible," she answered. "So, how exactly are you collecting the money?" I asked. One of the male students answered. "Well, we just tell people, the more money we get, the higher we climb." "Yikes, that seems a bit dangerous," I replied. "Indeed, it is, but we did receive a lot of donations from the people of this town," the second male responded. "Well, what exactly are we climbing?" I asked. "We are climbing the great mountain of Pinatubo," replied the female student, throwing her hands in the air for dramatic effect. I really wish she hadn't done that because she nearly hit the waitress right in the face with her hand, and thankfully, she only flinched and didn't drop my coffee. After a bit more talking, we had come up with a plan. Go to the mountain, climb to the crater, and swim in the crater for a bit so we could cool off for the journey back. And after I had finished my coffee and paid the cafe, we all left for the journey. After about half an hour later, we had arrived at Zambales. After we got out the car, we started toward the mountain. Most of the way toward the mountain was us just joking, except the fourth member. He hadn't said a single word the entire time that I was in the group, and I asked the female student, and she said, he doesn't speak good English, and not to mention he's pretty shy. It was kind of hard getting him to even go with us because of how much of an introvert he is." Well, that's fine with me. I honestly would take 3 out of 4 than none. And after we reached the mountain, we start to prepare. We stretched, put on safety equipment, and put on backpacks, and the way up the mountain was excruciating. I had never really climbed that much in my life, and on the way up we all learned each other's names. The male who first talked to me was Nimwell, the lady who first talked to me was Lantane, and the second male was Crisanto. And finally, The man who could not speak good English was Rodrigo. About halfway up the mountain, Nimble brought up an interesting topic. Do you guys know that some people have died on this mountain? Lantane responded saying, Duh, it's a mountain. People can die at any time on a mountain. The answer made me feel a bit uneasy. Nimble then said, No, I mean in the lake. 2 guys drowned in 1995. The cause of death for all of them was supposedly a heart attack while swimming. Well, where are they buried? Lantane asked. Nimble answered saying, That's the scary part. They won't let anyone even see the bodies. Rodrigo was obviously very unsettled by all of this, but still stayed quiet. I think we can all say that we were also very unsettled after the conversation had ended, and after about an hour of climbing, we finally reached the top. Oh goodness, look at that view! Lantane exclaimed. She was right. The view was pretty. Okay, now let's take a pictures for proof, and then let's take a swim, said Crisanto. First, we all took a quick breather, then we took some pictures, and after we took some pictures, we all took off our clothes. Thank God Lantane suggested that we keep our bathing suits on under our clothes so we don't have to strip naked and change. So, who's ready to swim? Exclaimed Crisanto. Everyone but Rodrigo was excited about going into the water. Lantane said something in Filipino, and then Rodrigo shook his head. Lantane shrugged and signaled us to go into the water. He must be still shaken with the story, I thought. When I got into the water, it was weird. Like it felt like water, but it felt really off. I don't really know how to put it, but it did not feel right. I brushed the odd water off, thinking that it was just because I had climbed a little over 1,000 meters. We swam and splashed water at each other for a good 15 minutes before getting bored and feeling like we were clean enough to head back down. On our way out of the lake, I swear I saw something underwater. It must have been some type of bug. But when Nimble was dragged underwater, I didn't think it was a bug anymore. I swam as fast as possible, not knowing what was going on behind me. Thankfully, Lantane didn't bother to help Nimble either, as she thought that it was just some type of sick joke. But we didn't think that it was a joke until he didn't come back up. Lantane, being the supposed brave one, went over to see if Nimble was all right. And trust me, when I say me and Crisanto tried to stop her, but she didn't stop. Rodrigo was already packing our bags when Lantane was dragged into and under the water. She didn't even have a chance to get into the water when she was dragged. We had to go. This thing, whatever it was dragging them underwater, killing them. We put on the necessities to climb down to the nearest flat part of the mountain where we could rest. And as we were putting on our climbing equipment, Rodrigo was probably cursing in Filipino. We were almost out of the crater when a tentacle came out of the water and then grabbed Rodrigo. I managed to hold on to him, but the thing pulled so hard, Rodrigo's hand was either pulled off or broken. All I know was that he was pulled really hard with me, still holding onto him, and then I was running for my life. Me and Crisanto were on our way down the mountain, and when we finally got to a pretty flat spot on the mountain, we got the rest of our equipment on. But we only got our helmets and safety rope attached when we saw tentacles going down the mountain towards us. How did it know where we were? The water, I thought. It had to be the water. That's why it didn't feel right. I warned Crisanto and we started to make our way down the mountain. We managed to reach the bottom of the mountain before that thing could catch us. And we guessed that the monster wasn't able to reach us at the bottom. and we ran right to the car after catching our breath. We didn't know what to do. The police wouldn't believe us. The locals wouldn't believe us. So we went back to my hotel since it was the closest. When we entered my room, I immediately turned on the news. Apparently, through the whole hour that we drove home, they had already started covering the story. The news reported sad. And for our viewers who are just joining us now, we have some very sad news. 3 teenagers have apparently drowned in the crater lake of Mount Pinatubo. While we asked if we could see the crime scene, officers told us that we had to leave immediately, and we will be following the story for the next few days. Any new information released to the public will be reported. Crisanto turned off the news, cutting off the reporter. "Can't believe that they're dead. It wasn't supposed to end like this," he said. I didn't expect him to say that. "We couldn't do anything. You saw how strong that thing was," I said, trying to comfort him. "How did the thing not go for them either?" "The water must have been tracking us, but Rodrigo was pulled into the water as well. That means the beast can sense anything near the lake and anything covered in the water," Crisanto said in anger. "Something isn't right, but we'll have to figure it out in the morning. It's getting late, and we've had one hell of a day." He agreed, and he fell asleep almost immediately. I didn't even realize how late it was, and it didn't feel that long. Maybe it was longer? I don't know. The next morning I woke up to no Crisanto, but a note from him. The note read, "Dear friend, while it was fun while it lasted, we both knew what happened, and if this is what I think it is, we cannot stay together, or else consequences will be dire. I thank you deeply for trying to help my friends and for attempting to comfort me when I was upset last night. Your dear friend, Crisanto." I have never heard from him again, and after I read the note, I packed my belongings and I left to reschedule my flight for that day. And I did manage to leave that day. I haven't talked about it since, in the fear of people thinking that I'm insane. But please, for the love of God, tell me I am not insane. Anyway, I beg of you to heed my warning. Do not swim in the lake of the crater of Mount Pinatubo. It is extremely dangerous, and without friends, you could have no chance of escape.
Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate each and every one of you. But I would also like to thank my amazing patrons, my top tippers, and my dearest channel members. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it with all of my heart. If you want to support the channel further, you could also choose to become a patron, a tipper, or a channel member. But remember, it's appreciated, but never a requirement. I would also like to announce that we have merch now. The link is in the description of the video, along with all my other social media links, like my Discord server, Twitter, Instagram, and others. You can connect with me and send your stories there. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and comments are highly appreciated. And remember, your fear feeds me.